Okay, we'll get started now, and let me welcome everyone to tonight's event. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeffrey Lamia. I'm president of the AIA New York Society. And on behalf of the Society, I would like to welcome you. It's going to be, I think, a very unusual and an excellent event this evening. What we will do is I'm going to mention the order of the program. We will start off with a brief presentation by Christina Stefanou, who is our New York Society scholar, winner of our Fieldwork Scholarship, which I'll explain more about. Then we'll have Dr. Donald Haggis talking about his work in Crete and other places. And after that, we will at the end for both questions related to both Ms. Stefanou and Dr. Haggis's presentations. We'll have a Q&A afterwards. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen that there is a chat function. So you're welcome to put in your questions as they occur to you in the chat function. They will go to our digital board member, who will then moderate the questions and answers after that. Before we begin these specific introductions, let me just mention again, as you all know, and many of you of course are familiar, but it's worth repeating, that the mission of the AIA is to foster the professional practice of archaeology, but also importantly is outreach to the general public. And both of those parts of the mission are done in a variety of ways, both in academic publications as well as fieldwork scholarships. The outreach to the general public, for example, in the case of the New York Society, is also we have a newsletter which all the members do receive and has a variety of information along with a listing of the lectures which we give, and as the current one is all the fall lectures. But we mirror very much the mission of the AIA at the national level. And in that regard, I've mentioned in past events and gatherings that we have inaugurated, this will be the third year now, we inaugurated what we call our New York Society Scholars Program. And the aim of that is to foster the study of archaeology by students here specifically among the New York-based colleges and universities. And we give every year, we nominate up to 6 New York Society scholars, and we provide them with free membership in the AIA, subscription to the American Journal of Archaeology if they want it. They get Archaeology magazine, and there are other things that we provide for them. In addition to that, they become eligible. One of them will, if they apply, they will become eligible to receive $1,500 scholarship to assist them to participate in some kind of field work. We've now, this year, we are out for recommending the professors start the process by recommending some of their students, and then the students write a little article, a little bit of biography of themselves and what they plan to do. This will be the 3rd cohort. The first cohort, which was a couple of years ago, out of those first cohort New York Society scholars, the young lady that I mentioned to you, Ms. Christina Stefanou, was the recipient of our first actual fieldwork scholarship and participated, as she will tell you, in fieldwork in Crete. We actually had to postpone the awarding of the fieldwork scholarship because given COVID, as everybody knows, all kinds of fieldwork was canceled and there was a complete disruption within universities, et cetera. But we're happy that Christina was awarded and was able to use our scholarship in her dig this past summer in Crete. There are also a second cohort, and those who will be nominated this year for the 3rd cohort. So actually, we're hoping things go well enough that we will award 2 fieldwork scholarships this year. Your support, your membership in the AIA, and then in turn to the New York Society, which is free if you just simply have to designate, is really very important to our work. And so if you are not a member, I urge you to join the AIA and designate the New York Society as your local society. So I'd also like in this regard, we have with us tonight one of a second cohort of students, New York Society scholars, Rebecca Tauscher, who was studying at Hunter College, and she's actually joining us from Rome, where she is a Paideia Institute Rome Fellowship recipient. So we have people not simply in the US, but from other parts of the globe joining in. And I would just say to all of you that our New York Society Scholars Program, and in turn, the Fieldwork Scholarship, is a major undertaking by the New York Society. And in order to continue, and you can see the excellent work that the scholarship fosters, really requires that you join the AIA if you haven't. And please also let me know through our website, www.aia-nysociety.org. You can become involved in the AIA. So it's a wonderful program, and you can see the wonderful work that our scholarship recipients are doing. I'd like to now turn to the main part of our presentation this evening, which is a lecture by Dr. Donald Haggis. Dr. Haggis is at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Actually, he's been there since 1993, when he began as an assistant professor, promoted in 1999 to associate professor, and then in 2001 to full professor in classical archaeology. In 2020, he was not only professor, but became department chair in the Department of Classics. Actually, no, that was from 2015, 2016. But he's also taught at a number of other universities earlier in his career: Macalester, University of Minnesota, Wayne State, and at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, aside from Duke University. He has other professional positions and appointments from Italy and Rome to Belgium to France to a number of different other parts of Europe. His field work is extensive. Azoria project, perhaps being his longest running and for which he's director, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that this evening. The quality of his work and his scholarship led to the AIA awarding him the Best Practices in Site Preservation Award in 2012. This was given at the AIA's annual meeting. But in addition to that, he's had numerous grants and scholarships from the Institute of Aegean Prehistory, National Geographic Society, National Science Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities. I could go on and on because there's so much. He also participates a lot in postdoctoral fellowships and grants of a lot of different institutions. His books and bibliography on classical archaeology in context, about excavation in the Greek world, also archaeological survey, state formation in Greece and Rome, and also other surveys in other parts of Greece. So he's written a lot. His articles and book chapters are from the CV that I have looked at. There were more than 70 entries listed and more than 30 listed in book reviews and internet publications. Serving as a referee, not only in organizations in the United States, this would be on refereeing for various kinds of publications of various kinds, but quite literally all over the Europe and for grants. So I'm sure it will be an exciting presentation. We are certainly fortunate to have with us this evening a very accomplished and well-recognized scholar. And so with this, I will turn it over to Dr. Haggis.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and for this invitation to address the New York Society. I congratulate you on the Scholars Program, and to Christina and the Lichtos team for a wonderful first season. I had the pleasure of visiting this summer, and I was thoroughly impressed. I think you'll find our work a little bit less sophisticated technologically, but I hope it'll provide some insights into what can be done after 20 years of work rather than 1 year of work. We have been working at Azoria as of last summer for the past 20 years. That also includes 10 years of excavation. This is field work that's conducted by the American School of Classical Studies at Athens with the support of the effort of Antiquities of Lasithi and the Institute for Aegean Prehistory Studies Center for East Crete. And I'm grateful to those institutions for their continuing support. At this stage, it's difficult to resist the impulse to provide a comprehensive overview of everything we've done in these past 20 years. So I thought what I would do is just touch on a few problems that we're working on and present some recent discoveries, emphasizing the urban phase of the site in the 6th century BC. The site of Azoria, and I show you a satellite image here, is located on the eastern end of the island, about 3 kilometers. Here's a map with more detail. About 3 kilometers from the eastern edge of the Bay of Mirabello, and it sits at a strategic transition between the Yerapatra Isthmus and the inland valleys of the Sitia Mountains. Now, while there's evidence of final Neolithic, late Minoan 3C, Proto-Archaic occupation at the site, its urban phase begins at the end of the 7th century BC. And it continues throughout the 6th until the site's abandonment in the early 5th century. Thus, the stratigraphic history of the site spans the entirety of the Archaic period. And while this phase is poorly understood on the island and rarely explored, at Azoria it takes the form of a large-scale aggregate with houses, as well as non-residential or communal buildings that show indications of public or civic functions. Azoria, though, lacks a known ancient place name, but the early and destructive abandonment of the settlement, as well as the subsequent growth and expansion of a number of nearby Greek cities in the region, such as Miletos, Dreros, Lato, Olus, Istron, and Oloros, may have served to obscure its historical memory by the classical and Hellenistic periods. So it is a bit of a mystery. It's an early Greek city without a name, occupied for 2 centuries, and then destroyed, abandoned, and buried without a trace or lingering material or epigraphic memory of its former identity. It's important to emphasize that in general, material evidence for early urban landscapes in Crete is generally lacking. There's no question that early 20th century interest in the island's prehistory created an enduring Bronze Age or Minoan research emphasis and sampling bias, and thus a remarkable imbalance with work on the archaeology of historical periods. At the same time, the island's unusually well-preserved and rich epigraphic corpus stimulated the study and documentation of inscriptions, as well as a robust discourse on social and political history and historical topography, though with little regard for archaeological context. Although this should not imply a particular disinterest in the archaeology, it has led to a dearth of well-documented material at our disposal, as well as a scholarly disconnect between archaeology and history, effectively limiting the potential of both fields to understand Archaic Crete. And this, I understand, is one of the principal interests of the Lichtos team going to that site, because it's been very prominent in the historical, literary, and epigraphical worlds of Cretan history, but we know very little about these earlier periods archaeologically from that site either. Now, Paula Perlman has recently compiled an inventory of 100 settlements of Archaic and classical date known from archaeological evidence and or written sources on the island, of which 64 have documented toponyms or city ethnics, and 49 of these comprise Paula Perlman's list of certain probable and possible cities, those either named in contemporary written sources or reasonably indicating functions of a polis. The archaeology of these settlements, however, both attested and unattested polis sites, is still poorly understood, with very few exceptions. Thus, from an archaeological perspective, it's difficult to say what an archaic Cretan city looked like. And written sources, the normal basis for our attribution of urban status, provide few direct clues. And it's important to note that those same sources do imply that the city center itself, that is, as a polis town, was perceived as a physical geographic entity, if not definable zone of occupation in the landscape, while the common use of city ethnics suggests a collective community of place. This general picture, that is the physical form and spatial definition of the city, is significant and seems to match our archaeological evidence of regional nucleation and coalescence of occupation. And this seems clear enough from our understanding of the topography of sites such as Dreros, which I show you here. This would apply to Phaistos, Gortyn, Axos, and certainly Prinias here, which is a bit earlier. And also then later classical cities such as Lato, which I show you here with its putative agora, stoas, prytanion, and temples. That is all the stuff you need to have a regular Greek city. So with few exceptions, though we know next to nothing of their internal forms or structures in the Archaic period, that is the specific details of their plans, spatial organization, or architectural forms, we know even less of their stratigraphic histories, especially in their earliest formative phases. So what did an archaic city look like within its urban core? That is, did it look like Lato, which I leave on the screen, which is 4th century date, or did it take on some other kind of form? So in lieu of epigraphical or historical attestation of Azoria's city status, I would like to present archaeological evidence that might reasonably indicate architectural forms and functions of an urban nucleus, and thus an example of what a polis town center might have looked like in archaic Crete. Now, I make no claims that all Cretan cities should have looked this way or had uniform sociopolitical systems or identical types of civic buildings to accommodate those systems, especially at such an early date. But given the lack of physical evidence or comparable extensive samples from other attested and excavated archaic polis towns, Azoria should provide a useful starting point that is a contextual model for beginning to examine the essential functions of an urban center in this period. We are, however, embarking on entirely new ground, discussing building forms and perhaps architectural types that simply stated have no cultural predecessors or contemporary parallels on the island, and few similar contexts anywhere in the Archaic Aegean. This is a view of the excavated area of the South Acropolis of the site from the west. Buildings were established at the end of the 7th century and occupied throughout the 6th century until an abandonment and burn destruction in the first quarter of the 5th century. So what we have here are two significant bookend events, discontinuities that we can detect archaeologically, a major phase transition about 630 BC, a century of continuous use, and then destruction in the early 5th century, providing us a remarkable picture of the entirety of the Archaic period. These images are just a few of our late Archaic destruction deposits. I'll show you some others later, just to give you some idea of the conditions of early 5th century levels and the character of the stratigraphic horizon across the site. Since so much of our work is centered on exposing and reconstructing components of the city center, and then relating this evidence to models of sociopolitical organization in the Archaic period, I thought that I would review what we know the Archaic urban topography today. Now, our work provides sufficient evidence to delineate a broad zone of what we call public buildings, and they comprise what we're kind of shaping into a civic complex, occupying the upper west and south slopes of the South Acropolis. Now, we've defined and named 4 different buildings within the complex: the communal dining building on the upper west slope, immediate below it, on a big wide open terrace, is the monumental civic building. And on the terrace below that, there's the west building, which we just finished excavating in 2017. And this is a large centralized storage facility. In the southeast corner of the excavated area, there's a 4th group of rooms separated by an archaic street, which we call the service building. Now, evidently, this was closely connected by streets to the monumental civic building and the West building. It consists of a series of rooms, storerooms, kitchens, and food processing and preparation areas, basically kitchens. And we're still working out the details of it. We have problems because of later erosion and deep plowing on the terraces, but we're gradually piecing together a picture of that. I'm going to leave that out of the discussion for the most part today. I'll show you some work in that area, but I want to focus mostly on the communal dining building and the monumental civic building today. Now, on the periphery of the civic zone, there were buildings that we've classified as residential in form and function, that is houses, which were connected to the civic complex by a series of parallel streets and spine walls. And the main public buildings of the complex were accessible on the west. Here are the residential buildings here, and the two lowest civic buildings are on the slide here, the monumental civic building and the West building. But the entrance to the complex actually bisects these two structures. So the main entrance is from the west through a pylon and a 45-meter long ramp that led up to a wide open terrace and platform, which is there with the arrow, directly in front of the main hall of the monumental civic building. The terrace is also joined by an east-west street that led up the slope to the communal dining building. Now, another wide street running directly beneath this ramp provided access to the propylon ascending ramp and the entrance to the civic complex, as well as connecting to houses and more directly to the service building, which lies to the south. That same street runs directly above the West building that, as I indicated before, is the last structure that we excavated. And I want to pause on this building briefly because it's a new discovery and brings into sharper focus an important pattern emerging from our work at the site, which is that a large part of the space within the city center seems to have been devoted to various forms of scaled up and centralized, probably state-level storage, processing, and consumption of food. That is, the transition in the late 7th to early 6th centuries evidently involved a dramatic shift in the scale of construction and the formalization of public space, but also an expansive change in the nature and scale of the agro-pastoral economy. Now, the West building is a freestanding architectural unit. It's about 36 meters long and 7 meters wide, bordered on the north and south by stairways, allowing passage up the bedrock slope to the main north-south street above, and thus providing direct access to residential buildings such as the Northwest building and also the other civic buildings. Now, the structure is composed of 9 interconnected rooms arranged in a row along the bedrock terrace. The terrace itself is about 250 square meters with a total interior area of about 140 square meters of floor space. There are indications of entrances to the rooms from the west, where there was likely a street that's no longer preserved, but the main entrance to the building may have been from the south through a vestibule in D3000 on the far right of the screen. Now, on preliminary analysis of the form, context, and assemblages, especially the dense deposits of pithoi, amphorae, jars, and plant remains, the building's function is consistent with that of a storehouse, suggesting the organization of a wide range of foods by the city or some other super household authority. If the total internal area were committed to agricultural storage, which seems likely, we could estimate the building's pithos or storage jar capacity at about 40,000 liters. And here are some examples of the jars that we're talking about. These are pithoi that have been studied and mended so far, and they range in size from about 250 liters to over 600 liters. This estimate is derived from computing average pithos capacities and numbers of pithoi per square meter of floor space. It doesn't account for the volume of smaller vessels, such as amphorae hydrias that I show you here and other perishable containers, such as cloth or hide sacks, woven baskets, or even wooden boxes. Such vessels would significantly increase the volume. And here are some examples of archaic amphorae and hydrias in the building, and this is what they, this is just a relatively small sample that we've mended recently. Now, on the other hand, it may be unlikely that the entire floor surface was occupied by such containers, and perhaps not all rooms were used at the same time, but the numbers do emphasize the significant potential pithos capacity of this single building. The allocation of space for storage on an unprecedented scale on Crete or elsewhere in the Aegean for this period, and the construction and dedication of a separate standalone building to accommodate and centralize the storage of agricultural produce. And here's a pithos being collected during excavations. This is a rather time-consuming and laborious task to clear these rooms of these enormous jars. So anyway, work in the West Building adds significantly to this emerging picture of civic storage. Now, continuing study of the plant remains in the building by Margie Scarry, and this is, she's faculty in anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at UNC and director of the research laboratories. Her work is beginning to show us some details of the organization and perhaps segregation of foodstuffs. So pulses such as chickpea, broad bean, lentil, and cereals like wheat and barley may be concentrated in certain rooms such as D3300 and 3400, which also lack the dense pithos scatters, perhaps indicating a preference for smaller perishable containers for those products. D3400 is in the middle of the slide. Grapes, that is remains of grape must or wine lees, and olives correlate strongly to rooms with numerous pithoi. For example, grapes were prevalent in D2800, shown here, and D3100, shown here. And this is probably a good indication that the pithoi in these rooms contained a very large volume of wine. And here's a small pithos from D2800 during conservation, and the finished product here. This would be on the smaller end of the storage jar spectrum, as it were. The distribution of olives is more widespread. It's harder to interpret, and it seems olives seem to scatter across all of the rooms. Though a preliminary study of the residual remains from the floor of D2500 shows a relatively higher volume in this room, which also had several large pithoi and smaller jars in situ. Now, the remains of these seeds, the remains are seeds, that is carbonized seeds, and they're just residues or cumulative traces of what these rooms could have contained during their use life. And this also introduces an important question of formation processes. But Scarry's preliminary study indicates the possibility of segregation of produce, and we kind of map it out here. In addition to grape, olive, grain, pulses, there were figs, pomegranate, and almond, as well as traces of mastic and medic. The range of foods is on the whole diverse, and thus not dissimilar to that of other civic and residential cooking and dining contexts on the site, which overall reflect shorter term storage for consumption, perhaps for the preparation of meals, banquets, or public feasts, rather than long-term staple surpluses. While storerooms have been found elsewhere in civic contexts, the West Building is the first identifiable structure committed exclusively to this purpose. And this alone should reorient our discussion on the agricultural basis for the political economy of early Cretan cities. Now, we haven't yet begun sorting out the full artifact inventory from these rooms. It is a daunting task, also seriously disrupted by COVID, though some interesting things have begun to materialize. Of course, large decorated pithoi are the most prevalent, as I've already shown you. Here's one jar we finished mending recently from the largest storeroom in the complex, and the image shows both sides of the pithos, with the highly decorated side on the right evidently meant to face out into the space of the room, emphasizing the importance of social symbolic display in the use of these otherwise utilitarian objects. The trench supervisor here, who excavated the pithos, is shown holding a fragment of yet another jar from the same room with impressed design of a running hoplite figures in the so-called Niederlauf or Waffenlauf position. And here's the sherd recovered from the ongoing and monumental task of Pithos reconstruction, and ultimately the pot that it came from. A relatively small jar, but highly ornate. Some interesting things mended over the past 2 summers include a large incense burner, a variety of small metal and worked bone finds. Here's a bracelet, fishhook, and dress pin, and several miniature vases on the lower left, which we think might be related to abandonment phase sacrificial activities within the rooms. There's also an enormous crater from D3100, a room probably committed to wine storage. And here's the crater after mending. And from D2500, just one of the many pithoi, this one elaborately decorated in relief with rows of impressed meanders, cranes, centaurs, arcades, and interlocking S-spirals. So study of this building has allowed us to explore formation processes, as well as sort of the accoutrements of a large-scale storage facility, and to visualize more clearly a pattern evident across the site, which involves ritual or ritualized abandonment. And I'm not going to elaborate on this today, but I will show you some indications. And one is the presence of agrimi horns. These are wild goat horns that were evidently displayed or deposited in the room at the time of abandonment. And we also find the sacrificial deposits of burned lower legs and horn cores of goats. And also in every building, Triton's trumpet shells distributed throughout the destruction debris, such as here, this is in D3100, which was a large, which was full of fairly large pithoi. So the West Building constitutes evidence for a critical stage in the process of mobilization and administration of agricultural surplus, perhaps functioning as an intermediary facility between houses and public dining buildings, a place where payments of foodstuffs could be collected, measured, monitored, and temporarily stored before being cycled into storerooms of other buildings in the civic complex, which we'll get to in a second. Indeed, evidence from inscriptions from contemporary urban centers, such as Oxos, Gortine, and Datawa, tell us that payments of produce were made as wages for the sustenance of employees, for sacrifices, and to the Andrion, which is a communal dining hall. They also include amounts of great must, barley, and figs, but very little other specific produce is mentioned in the inscriptions. So we're not provided a complete list of things in the documents, but we do know that from the Gortinian Code that produce was paid into public stores and was collected and managed by officials called the carpodistai, or the produce distributors. It may be that the archaeology of storage at Azoria can provide some critical details lacking in these 6th and 5th century historical and epigraphical sources. Now our questions include, where did all of this produce go? How is it used and consumed, and ultimately for what purposes? And how does this emphasis on agropastoral activities relate to the broader economic and social structure of the early city? And for this, we need to look briefly at other main components of the civic center, that is what we call the monumental civic building and the communal dining building, both located upslope, you can see from the West Building. Now, as I mentioned, the monumental civic building was reached from a long north-south street above the West Building by ascending into a propylon and ramp that led to an open platform on an artificial terrace in front of the building's main hall. Now, this platform was also accessible from a street on the south that led down to the service building. And I could just give you an aerial view of the best preserved rooms of the structure. Again, this is the building that we're still working on. And I won't go into the details, but it does include remarkably diverse assemblages of food storage, serving, and preparation equipment. And the slide of this whole range of vessels actually comes from a kitchen and an adjoining storeroom. But nearly all the rooms in the complex had these rich abandonment phase deposits with a full range of food preparation, storage, and serving equipment. And it's important to mention that this service building also bordered a street that led to both the platform in front of the main hall, as well as a ramp descent through the complex up to the communal dining building. That's this arrow here. It's difficult to see, but the ramp itself survives actually in the form of this very dense and heavy cobble fill that was probably supported by a series of risers as well. But it's been badly eroded in at this particular point. Now, the main hall of the civic building is the monumental civic building is an impressive space. It consists of really one of the largest roof public buildings of the Archaic period not yet documented in the Greek Aegean. A distinctive feature is a well-built ashlar bench preserved on 3 sides of the hall, which allows a minimum seating capacity of about 80 to 100 people. Though much larger groups could easily have been accommodated in the space of the room. And if the west wall were equipped with a stone bench, which we think it was, although only the northwest corner of the building survives. The number and configuration of participants probably vary depending on protocols of movement, whether people were sitting or standing on the bench or within the hall itself, and specific occasions of use or different kinds of activities. Now, the floor deposit at the time of abandonment consisted mostly of feasting debris, and a lot of this was embedded within the matrix of the clay floor itself. Mostly drinking and serving vessels, a scattering of olives and almonds were recovered from the surface. There were 2 whole vessels in the southeast corner, a lacani and a situla, found near the south bench, and both of these pots were pretty remarkable. They both contained remains of stews. The lacane had wheat, broad bean, and grapes, while the situla held a mixture of chickpeas, grapes, onions, and sheep or goat meat. Among the faunal remains scattered throughout the building were pig, sheep, goat, very little cattle. In some cases, whole leg segments may have been brought into the space, already roasted, and then apportioned for consumption. And here's some later representations in classical vase painting of honorific and sacrificial leg joints to give you some idea of the kinds of pieces brought into the building. Ritual use of the hall is indicated by the presence of 3 cupule stones or kernoi, where one kernos was found lying face down on the bench, and 2 others were inscribed on the top step of the eastern bench. These are, of course, kernoi are, of course, traditional Minoan objects, more at home in the Bronze Age or palatial or burial contexts where they functioned as offering tables, probably for first fruits offerings. They are interesting. We have several other kernoi from the site that introduce interesting questions of continuity from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age down into the Archaic period. Now, near the northwest corner of the hall, where you see this arrow, a stair led up to a terrace fronting 2 adjoining rooms, which form an annex of sorts that we call the hearth shrine. The rooms occupy a bedrock terrace about 1 meter higher than the floor level of the main hall and overlook the access ramp to the building. The southernmost room of the shrine had a built bench altar and adjoining curbed hearth. And here's a detail of the altar. On and around it was assemblage of votive objects, including late geometric and didalic female figurines, a didalic plaque, a terracotta bovine figurine, and a variety of miniature skiphoi, a bronze cup, and ribbed offering stands, and various marine shells, as well as sheep, goat, pig, and cattle bones. The adjoining north room, apparently used as a kitchen and a pantry, had a stone quern in situ on the floor, as well as a curbed hearth in the center of the room. And the vessels were mostly concentrated on the eastern half of the room. Most of the western half of the kitchen, unfortunately, had eroded away by the time we got to it. The butchering debris and meat elements suggest at least 2 goats, as well as marine shells, and there were traces of olive, grape, barley, pulse, and almonds, probably residues of food stored or prepared in this space. 2 small pithoi, 3 transport amphorae, a number of cook pots, a bowl, a tray, and a lacane confirm the function of the space as a fully functioning kitchen, though other vessels, such as this proto-geometric B-style crater and high neck cups, an attic lamp, and exalibtron may have been stored here for ritual use within the adjacent altar room, or even in the main hall of the building, accessible by that staircase. Now, whatever communal assemblies took place in the main hall, it's clear that sacrificial rituals were part of the activities, and it's tempting to see the integration of public dining and ritual as not dissimilar from activities conducted in Prytania elsewhere in the Greek world. Now, adjacent and upslope from the monumental civic building is the communal dining building, which provides a very different form of public feasting. This structure is a confusing complex of at least 30 rooms extending across 4 contiguous terraces of the west and south slopes. On the west, where the building is best preserved, the rooms are positioned in regular rows along the north-south contours. And the total extent and excavated area so far is about 1,200 square meters. So the building evidently continued somewhat beyond the current excavated area, especially in the southwest, where the archaic levels have been lost to post-abandonment disturbance or otherwise by our Hellenistic occupation. Now, the topography of the archaic remains, the organization of spaces and the repetition of assemblages allow us to reconstruct the building's basic design and its principal functions. The complex is made up of at least 3 groups of storage rooms, food processing areas, or what we call kitchens, also dining rooms, and there's also a central sanctuary or altar room for sacrifices on the uppermost terrace next to one of the dining rooms. So while the internal relationships and intercommunication between the rooms are not yet fully understood, we do have a problem on the outer edges of the slopes. Erosion has often destroyed remains of the upper reaches of the western walls, which confuse our interpretation of communication between these various levels of the terraces. But we have been pretty good about looking at the terrain and ascertaining where the likely transitions would have been. There are logical transitions across the terraces, as well as visible vestibules and corridors that suggest the interconnection between these different levels. It's reasonable to conclude, based on the distribution of rooms and their logical interconnections, that there were certainly at least 3 different suites of dining rooms with associated food processing and storage facilities. So these 3 listed here, it's sort of cut off in the image on the right, but there are 3 very, very clear suites of dining aggregations of dining rooms, along with service areas of storage and food preparation. The clustering of these rooms, especially the dining rooms, and the presence of multiple and replicated assemblages suggest communal rather than normal or normative residential or domestic activities. And if you zoom in on these, again, possibly a 4 suite down here that has been eroded away. Here's one of the storerooms, just to give you an example. Storerooms are indicated very easily by the presence of pithoi and the remains of stored produce, large amounts of produce, such as wine, olives, figs, pulses, cereals, hackberry, and poppy, recorded from this particular room, as well as stored serving and drinking vessels, such as cups, skiffoi, vessel stands, and other serving equipment, such as basins or lacanas, Here's a lacani on the floor of that room, and then traces of both grapes and olives, and two of the, I think, 6 or 7 jars that were recovered from that particular storeroom. Other finds include bronze. Bronze is very fragmentary. It's kind of residual, but from the upper terrace of the communal dining building was the shield boss, and also this is a fragment. This bit on the right here is a fragment of the helmet crest, indicating that armor was worn, stored, or displayed in the building. The helmet crest is interesting because it's the upper part of this tall arcing crest of the distinctive open-faced Cretan type of helmet, and ours is decorated with incised lotus flowers, guilloche, and wave patterns. And also interesting about ours is that it has traces of either hemp or flax twine that was used to secure the plume between the folds of the bronze in the upper part of the helmet. Food processing areas, that is kitchens, have cooking installations such as hearths or ovens. There are also stone tools and cook pots, as well as a considerable amount of food debris and an array of drinking and serving vessels. Dining rooms are normally open halls, for the large part empty, with residual drinking and dining debris embedded in their clay floors. Though in some cases, and we're very lucky to have these, food debris, well, such as these are animal bones and marine shells, but remains not of butchering, but of actual cut meat portions, ended up in dumps that were found in the kind of penultimate abandonment stage in some of these dining rooms. And these dump areas include drinking and serving vessels, vessel stands, food remains, and cook pots of various sizes. And here's just a variety of pots from the building. Some of these come from pantries and kitchens. Others have been assembled from these large dining debris dumps, which are scattered throughout the building. One interesting find that indicates the scale of meal preparation are fragments of these. It doesn't look like much, but we have literally hundreds of fragments of these things, and they're called lasanas, and they were actually base supports for very large round bottom, like cauldron-like cook pots. So these would be like a brazier. These would be the terracotta supports to support the pot over the flame. But they're normally used for very large pot boiling, very large vessels for pot boiling meat, as is shown here in this vase from this archaic vase from the Villa Giulia, just as an example. Also indicating, well, we have imports as well, such as this Rhodian fruit stand and this Attic lekathos. We have other East Aegean imports and Athenian imports. And communal serving is suggested by the prevalence of these large terracotta stands, which likely held craters, denoi, basins, and other large vessels. I don't know what our count is on these. They're mostly fragmentary. There are a couple of whole ones and partially and large fragments of them. But the best preserved ones actually come from the floors of the dining rooms. And these are simply large terracotta stands, some fenestrated, but normally ornately decorated, that held craters or denoi, basins, luteria, or other vessels. And these objects are found across the rooms of the building with the highest concentrations in the dining rooms. So the multiplicity of contiguous and interconnected architectural units and the clustering of activity areas are distinctive. The plan overall is unusually segmented and compartmentalized, suggesting the accommodation of different groups of people, perhaps for different occasions or formal gatherings. and the allocation of space for various forms and scales of food and drink storage and preparation. Also, the presence of an altar, I do want to zoom in on this for a second, it's kind of interesting. The presence of an altar in the middle of the uppermost terrace tells us that routine sacrificial activities accompanied the feasting. The room is positioned between two dining halls and directly accessible from the porch and vestibule that mediated the transition from food storage and processing to rooms on the terrace, on the terrace below. Between the food processing areas on the terrace below, which you can see here, and then the dining rooms on the terrace above. Here's a detail of the altar in that room, around which were found concentrations of ash containing burned bone fragments and a significant variety of seeds and other food remains. The altar is an oblong bench about 2.5 meters in length, consisting of 3 one-course high platforms, each separated from the other by a divider or header stone. So it's not an elaborate thing by any means, but the extraordinarily wide range of plant material, as well as the fragmentary calcined bone, indicate regular and routine offerings of food, probably first fruits, probably burned as Holocaust sacrifices, that is, portions of meals or samples of foods brought into the building. There were other animal bones scattered around the room. A pig's scapula showed evidence of partial chopping or breakage, indicating the reduction of a large meat segment into smaller portions. And another goat scapula had a chop mark on the medial face, also probably resulting from the reduction of a meat portion. So the butchering and meat bone debris indicate that the sanctuary was evidently also used for preparing meat, portions for meals of banqueters, as well as for that of the gods, such as Zeus Xenios. Now, the kind of cleaver butchery found in the communal dining building accords well with this image from the contemporary Ritios crater, where you can see a table. Well, here's a table stand, probably a wooden table, and then large leg joints being cut into smaller pieces, into more manageable pieces that could be put on a spit or could have been pot boiled. Now, the clustering of activity areas and an alternation of blocks of dining and food processing rooms are noteworthy features of this building's design. The arrangement of the suites suggests several discrete groups of diners within the same building, that is, separate social or political identities expressed through architectural segmentation and exclusion, but within shared civic space. That is, each group would have enjoyed the same or similar privileges of access and participation, but each would have had their own designated rooms or suites within the larger communal space. So what social units or civic subdivisions or political collectives these groups of diners at Azoria could represent is simply unknown, though it's likely, given the regular size of the dining rooms, about 28 to 35 square meters in area, that each of these groups would have numbered between 20 and 60 individuals, depending on the occasion, the function of the participating group, and the number of rooms occupied by a single group, and the ordering of the social divisions or activities by room or by suite. We simply don't know. Now, contemporary inscriptions do provide some evidence of the existence of such groups. They mentioned both the Startos, which is presumably some kind of tribal division that we don't know for sure, as well as the Hetaria, which is some kind of fellowship or association. Though only the latter has been linked to communal dining per se. Later Greek historical and literary traditions do mention or even elaborate a Cretan institution and building called the Andrion, which is a men's communal dining hall. So although we're given very little detail on its architectural form, we do know that Andria or communal dining halls did exist in archaic cities. Now, it's difficult to make a connection between a particular social group and the Andrion. It's that and dining, dining of that particular group. The association is absent in extant epigraphical sources. But in the inscriptions, the Andrion is a public building. We know it's used for communal dining and ritual. and it's supplied at least in part by state resources and obligations of individuals. So at Azoria, the structure is tightly agglomerated and organized around public buildings that centralize but also internalize and regulated food storage and processing for large-scale feasting and sacrifice. The positioning of residences and roads emphasizes less the intercommunication between houses and kinship groups, but rather interactions between households and the civic complex itself. So the topography of the city is not easily definable in normative classical Aegean forms of centralized, demarcated, communal, and multifunctional open air spaces, such as agoras or a common economic center or an urban sanctuary. So the structure, both formal and organizational, is tightly integrated. The different venues of consumption, the single open hall in D500 and the closed suites of dining rooms in the communal dining building suggest different forms of public interaction and performance, occasions and temporalities, different occasions and different temporal frames for feasting, and different configurations of participants, and perhaps also modes and scales of food consumption. Now, this picture is, of course, simplified and reductive in its spatial modeling and its emphasis on agricultural resources. There are other things that we might have looked at, but the basic patterns of interaction may provide a model or a template of resource mobilization that helps us to begin assessing the complexity of the political economy of archaic cities. Now, the evidence of urbanization at Azoria consists of material patterns that demonstrate the scaling up of building practices and the formalization of social spaces, and the increased complexity of socio-political and economic interactions in the 6th century BC. These are, of course, only inferences derived from the archaeology, but the study of the material remains may provide a means of interpreting various structures of behavior, encouraging a narrative of the early city that's not limited to a static or synchronic reflection of historical or normative institutions, but rather one that is methodologically fluid and materially expansive. So the material patterns and formal characteristics are to some extent contextual, interpretive, and qualitative, and therefore not strictly probative of a city, but they do suggest the use of architecture to structure assemblies, to organize and mediate new social configurations and economic interactions within the community, and ultimately to create through monumentality, design, and the practice of building a highly visible social symbolic expression of community identity in the landscape. Contextual analyses provide the basic tools to begin reframing a discussion of the urban landscape as social and political space and process, while presenting material evidence that could also inform our understanding of written sources and perhaps later historical and literary traditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Haggis. That was really interesting. Folks, I just want to remind you that if you have a question, please put your question into the chat function, and our digital monitor will kind of read the question and consolidate things. If I could start off, while people are putting hopefully their questions, I really have two sort of questions, Donald. The one is, which I can just click off very quickly, is physical, in terms of evidence for source of water, wells or anything like that, or separately from that, kilns. But so that's on one side. The other side, which I found your remarks and the work you're doing really interesting about the social structure. And I particularly liked that it's not simply communal or residential, that it's sort of a mixture, and that you have both this segmentation, these suites that you talk about, which I think is really interesting. And because, I mean, the first thing that immediately popped into my mind, thinking of ethnological and anthropological literature, is kinship groups and of various kinds that both separate, but yet also are part of the community, and how that interacts, et cetera. Is this kind of segmentation visible and this is my own ignorance, are visible in the archaeological record in other sites of this period or later?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, Jeff. I mean, the I'm not a classical archaeologist, and I'm not really a classical archaeologist. I'm not really an historian of Crete either. I'm a prehistorian. So coming at this site from a prehistoric perspective, I naturally began looking for kinship associations. That's really what I wanted to see in the data. Certainly coming from the early Iron Age, I think it's inescapable that even as early as the 12th century, but looking at burial patterns as well as sort of settlement structure, we really have to imagine a kinship group that is larger and more complex socially and economically than the stem family. My own feeling is that we have to do this throughout the Greek Aegean as well. I don't see the stem family as, or the nuclear family as being the basic economic unit. So I think especially in the Archaic period, in the early Iron Age, that there have to be larger social economic configurations of the household. And I've tried to impose that bias and my preconception of larger kinship structures onto Azoria, and I've gotten considerable pushback from historians who argue that we don't have any definitive language for the clan in Crete. And so some people have tried to take the term startos and to read it as genos or something comparable to the clan. And my argument has always been, just because it isn't mentioned in inscriptions, in our surviving sample of inscriptions, it doesn't mean that it didn't exist. And so, you know, I see households, and I think it's pretty easy to model for Crete as well, as households as pretty large economic entities, not only with extended kin, but also a variety of dependent shareholders, and of course, even slaves. So I rather like the oikos model, sort of a larger social configuration for, you know, elite citizen households at Azoria. And our houses are quite large and are mobilizing huge amounts of produce that extend well beyond the subsistence needs of an individual family. So it's a good question, but there are sort of the Greek historians and epigraphers don't like archaeologists to use the clan for Archaic Crete, although they're willing to accept it for the early Iron Age. And yet, on the other hand, there are historians like Ian Morris who actually, in their analysis of the Gortinian Code, also don't like the the interpretive thread of the great historian Willits, who also argued for the possible existence of the clan. So there's a kind of tension in the literature between whether or not the clan exists as a socioeconomic functionary in early Cretan society. So could these subdivisions represented in these for example, in the communal dining building, represent kinship groups or some kind of lineage structure? I suppose it's possible, but you'd have a hard time convincing historians of that argument.
I'm going to step in here right now. Dr. Haggis, Ms. Stefanu, thank you both for focusing so much on architecture. As an architecture geek myself, I was really excited to see the imagery that you brought in your analyses. We have a question here from Robert Cole asking about the dining rooms. This is for you, Dr. Haggis. Since it seems that the Cretans ate while seated rather than reclining, did you find any clusters of carbon that might suggest the remains of wooden benches?
in those rooms, we in the dining rooms of the communal dining building, we haven't had all the charcoal studied, and this is excellent work by Maria Dinu, who's mapped out like a pretty interesting range of possible woods that are being used. The largest amount of wood we have from the site is olive wood, and the largest sort of coherent pieces of charcoal that we have seem to represent roof beams, and those are all of olive, probably wild olive. And there are structural elements that are, I would have to check my notes on that to see what else we found. But there are other wood types, including, of course, oak. There's quite a lot of oak. There's pine. There's juniper. So there's a pretty wide range of wood in the room. And those other wood elements we connect to door frames, window frames, and also, of course, furniture, but also possibly tools and other implements such as looms. So we're investigating that. The dining rooms in the communal dining building, we have collected carbon from them. One of the problems with them is that has to do with formation processes, Bobby. It's a lot of the rooms were abandoned. It looks like in stages before the final abandonment of the site, and so the amount of burn destruction that preserves lots of wood wasn't in those areas. There was a lot of lateral cycling and filling in of those spaces pre-abandonment. So a number of those rooms had already collapsed or had already been abandoned and were used as dumps for dining debris right before the final abandonment phase. But we do have charcoal, and we are going to look through it. But unfortunately, well, there are a couple of problems with the communal dining building. You can kind of see it if I could just share my slide. I know this is maybe too much detail, but the slope here is rather, is rather extraordinary, and it's led to a huge amount of sheet erosion, and so what's happened is while we get really good ceramic assemblages, our botanical remains are subject to there's a significant seismic tilt and also erosion down to the clay floor levels, actually a subterranean erosion that is actually destroying a lot of the organic materials. So in some instances, for example, when a room has all four walls, if you can see it here, this is one of the storerooms, for example, the burned material is really well preserved. And unfortunately, the dining rooms, can you see my cursor in the slide? So I'll see that this is a dining room here, this is a dining room here, this is a dining room here, this is another, well, this is a kitchen here. But if you go down here, let me get rid of those things. This is a dining room here, this is a dining room here. Notice that the western walls, in fact, in this case, in this dining room right here, the entire, maybe a third of the room is actually eroded away. And so artifacts are well preserved on the floor surface, back up in the eastern inner slope of the room. But on the western edges, all of the material has eroded away. And what that's caused is sheet erosion, so that water finds its way down to the clay floor level, and it really wreaks havoc on botanical remains. We do get seeds, but we don't, and we do have significant, burn scars on the floors and on the walls, but we don't have the really rich chunks of charcoal that would preserve furniture. So I'm sorry to say, it would be great to be able to identify patterns actually in the charcoal of the dining rooms that could finally put to rest this this problem of how the Cretans were sitting. But yeah, we assume that they were sitting on wooden benches or wooden chairs, I guess would be the short answer.
All right, so it sounds like we've got very complicated site taphonomic processes going on here.
For sure.
I'm just going to go through the rest of the questions in chat in chronological order. We have another question here from Robert Cole, again, asking about the ceramics. Do you think that the pithoi in particular were locally made? And do you think they were made in the same workshops as some of the other unpainted but molded decorated pots like the stands?
Yeah, I mean, petrographically, the pots are, most of the pithoi are in the phyllite quartzite series. So they're if they're not locally produced, they're produced very close by. We do have imported pithoi. We do have a number of jars. In fact, the largest that we have, I think, well, the second largest that we have from the site, it's about an 800 liter, almost 1,000 liter jar. It's now on display in the AIA-NY Museum. Was an import from Istron that has granodiorite inclusion. So we do know that jars were coming in from, as far away as 20 kilometers. And that's an enormous jar. So that's taller than I am. If you can imagine its size, it's about 2.5 meters in height, maybe more. So there are imported, but otherwise we assume that the jars are locally made. But how local the phyllite quartzite series would extend, broadly in an area of about, probably about 60 or 70 square kilometers around the site.
I have a question for Christina. I'm curious as to what you found in the fieldwork this summer. What did you find that was surprising and or different significant about the fieldwork season?
Well, we found a lot of interesting and significant things. I think it's better to wait for the directors to present the material, but I would say for the proto-archaic, archaic material, we have a lot of imported ceramics, which is peculiar. We don't have a lot of Athenian, Corinthian imports at other sites in Crete, but we found a lot of them decorated and back figure at Lictos. And for the Roman building, we have great evidence for how the elevation and the interior of the building was like. And the marbled flags show that it was a pretty rich, decorated building. Of course, the inscriptions are important, and the statue is the highlight of the season. But let's wait for the final presentation of the material, which will be coming at some point.
Good, thank you. I have another question here for Dr. Haggis from Antonis Kotsonis. The question is regarding the public storeroom. Is it a peculiarity of archaic / classical Crete, or are there textual references and archaeological comparisons for it in other Greek regions of this period?
Thank you for that question. I have no idea. Again, our understanding of storage on Crete in the Archaic period is really an inference. So from epigraphical sources, and I haven't even looked beyond Paula Perlman and Michael Gagarin's book, which do talk quite a lot about. But I mean, their senses, and I can't remember if this is something I've read or if this is from talking to Paula Perlman. But their sense is that Cretan cities must have been mobilizing and storing huge amounts of agricultural produce, in a sense, as a civic activity. And they do acknowledge this. And the carpodicei, which I kind of passed over, I did actually pass over that paragraph, I think, in my paper. But the carpodicta, or the produce distributors, are mentioned as being responsible for both collecting from individuals, that is from households presumably, and then redistributing those things to various functions, not explicitly, but by association to the Andrion is one of the target areas. But they are definitely redistributing produce for sacrifice, for public sacrifice, as payment of wages and so on. So there's quite a lot of there's kind of inferential evidence that this was going on in Cretan cities, certainly as early as the classical period. Now, I'm at a loss in terms of the broader Aegean. Maybe you could help me. I mean, until you get to the Hellenistic and Roman periods, when I mean, I suppose the Piraeus would be the best source of information about large scale commercial storage. But the question there is not really commercial storage; it's really more of civic storage, and whether we have evidence from other areas. I'm unaware of it, but to be honest with you, I haven't looked in the last 3 years.
Okay, well, I want to thank both Ms. Stefanou and Dr. Haggis for excellent presentations. I really enjoyed them. I'm sure everybody else did as well. And please check our website for future lectures, and we'll look forward to seeing you. Actually, Dr. Haggis, if you could just hang on after we're all done, that'd be great.
Okay, sure.
Again, thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.